Montana Territory, 1883. The wind cut sharp across the empty plains as the train pulled into the dusty station at Dry Creek. Gray clouds hung low, and the snowmelt had turned the dirt road into a stretch of thick brown paste. Gwendolyn Hart stepped off the last car, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. She kept her chin high, fingers gripping the worn leather strap of her satchel. 41 years old, unmarried, and alone except for the two children she had just taken in, a girl with a quiet stare and a boy too young to understand what they had lost. The townsfolk did not whisper. They just looked. A woman her age arriving with someone else's children, no husband in sight. People made their own stories. Gwendolyn had no interest in explaining anything. She turned and held out her hand to the little ones behind her. "Come now. We're not staying out here long." Arabella, age 8, clutched her small bag and nodded. Her younger brother, Amos, barely 5, dragged his feet but reached for Gwendolyn's hand with trust that still made her heart ache. Their mother, Gwendolyn's cousin, had passed 2 weeks ago in a Denver boarding house, and no one else had stepped forward. Gwendolyn had not hesitated. They walked together toward the livery, where a wagon waited. She had already arranged to rent a place just outside town, a small homestead left vacant by a widow gone back east. It was not much, but it had a roof, a stove, and a fence that needed mending. She could work with that. She was lifting Amos into the back of the wagon when a man's voice stopped her. "I can help with that." She turned and blinked at the tall man standing a few paces away. His hat was pushed back just enough to show a strong brow and eyes like the sky right before a storm. He looked about her age, maybe a year or two older, with a weathered face and quiet calm in his stance. "I have it, thank you," she said. He did not move. "You are Gwendolyn Hart." She narrowed her eyes. "Yes, and you are Xavier Prescott." He tipped his hat. "I run cattle on the South Range. Your property borders mine." She gave a tight nod. "Then we are neighbors." He stepped forward slowly, careful not to spook the children. "I heard you were coming. Folks said you took in 2 little ones." "I did." He looked at Arabella and Amos with a softness that surprised her. "That was kind of you." "I did not do it to be kind. I did it because they had no one." "That is the best kind of kind." He met her eyes. "You will need help fixing that fence before spring calves start wandering over." "I can handle it." "I do not doubt that." His smile was faint but warm, like coals that could burn steady. "But I am offering." Gwendolyn studied him. He was not trying to charm her. He was not looking at her with pity, just honest, quiet patience. "We will see," she said. He helped her lift the crates into the back of the wagon anyway. Arabella watched him with guarded eyes. Amos tried to touch the horse's tail and got a gentle warning from Gwendolyn. As she climbed up to take the reins, Xavier stepped back. "Welcome to Dry Creek, Miss Hart," he said. "If you need anything, I am a short ride east." She nodded once and drove off. That night, while the children slept curled up under borrowed quilts, Gwendolyn stood on the porch and looked out across the dark land. The house creaked with wind, the chimney smoked a little, and something about the stillness settled in her chest like peace she had forgotten how to feel. She had not come here to start over. She had come because there had been nowhere else to go, but a man had helped load her wagon without asking questions. And he had known her name. The next morning, the fence was already half mended. She looked out the window, eyes narrowing. Xavier stood at the edge of her property, hammering in a new post. He worked with slow, practiced ease, glancing toward the house once, then going back to his task. She stepped outside, arms crossed over her shawl. "I did not ask you to do that." He did not stop hammering. "I know, you do not owe me anything." "I know that too." "Then why?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "Because I was waiting for you." She blinked. "What? I've lived out here a long time, watched folks come and go, got told I missed my chance more than once." He shrugged. "But I always figured when the right person came along, I would know." Gwendolyn stood still as the wind picked up her hair. "I do not even know you," she said. "You will." And then he tipped his hat and walked back to his horse. Arabella came out onto the porch, rubbing her eyes. "Who was that man?" Gwendolyn swallowed. "A neighbor." He fixed the fence. "Yes." "Is he nice?" Gwendolyn looked out across the land again, saw Xavier swing into his saddle and ride off slow but sure. "Yes," she said. "I think he is." Over the next weeks, he came by with tools, with flour when the store ran short, and once with a book for Arabella. He never stayed long, never pushed. But he always looked Gwendolyn in the eye, and he always asked before stepping close. She had never had anyone do that before. One morning, while Amos was playing with a wooden horse and Arabella was helping wash dishes, Gwendolyn found herself stepping outside just to look toward Xavier's land. He was already riding up the hill. She met him halfway this time, no shawl, no distance. "I made stew," she said. "I like stew." She smiled, small but real. They ate together while the children laughed inside, and when the wind came up, he helped her close the shutters. As he turned to go, she reached out and touched his coat sleeve. "I was told I was too old to marry," she said softly. He turned back to her, his voice low. "I was told I was too late," he said, "but I was only waiting for you." She looked up at him, and for the first time in years, her heart did not ache, it stirred. The thaw came slow that year, lingering in patches across the grassland like a memory that wouldn't quite let go. Gwendolyn stood at the edge of her field with a hoe in hand, sleeves rolled to her elbows, watching the ice break apart along the creek that cut through the lower pasture. The land was softening, turning from brittle to promise, and she felt it in her chest like something uncoiling. Behind her, Arabella hung sheets on the line, her small hands careful with the clothespins. Amos sat in the dirt nearby, carving a stick with the dull pocket knife Xavier had given him 2 days prior. Gwendolyn had said nothing at the time, but she'd noticed the boy sleep with it clutched in his hand that night. She heard the horse before she saw it. The hoofbeats were paced, not hurried, not hesitant, and she didn't turn until Xavier's shadow reached hers. He dismounted without a word, leading his mare by the reins. "You don't ride up like that unless you've got something to say," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "I don't plan to stay long," he said, tying the reins to the fence post. "But I came to ask if you'd let me take the children fishing this Saturday. There's a quiet bend on the Judith River. I used to go there when I was a boy." She blinked once. "You want to take them alone? I'd understand if you said no, but I thought it might be good for them, and for you if you wanted the time." Gwendolyn's jaw tightened slightly, not out of distrust but out of habit. She glanced back at Amos, who was now standing, interested. "I don't know if they've ever held a fishing pole." "Then they'll learn," she studied Xavier. His coat was dusted with pollen from the cottonwoods, and his collar sat uneven like he dressed in a hurry, but his eyes were steady and he waited without pressing. "Take them," she said finally. "Arabella will pack lunch and I'll lend you a clean blanket," he nodded. "I'll see to their safety, you have my word." "I know I do." She turned back to the field, but her fingers paused on the handle of the hoe. "Xavier," he stopped mid-step. "I haven't had anyone offer me space before." "Or time." "You've earned both," he said, and then he was gone, boots brushing over last year's dead grass. That Saturday, she watched the 3 of them ride away, Amos on Xavier's saddle in front, Arabella upright behind, her arms wrapped around Xavier's middle. They looked like a family. It stirred something in Gwendolyn that she didn't have a name for. With the house quiet, she boiled water and scrubbed the floorboards near the hearth. Then she sat in the rocker by the window and stitched a tear in the hem of her oldest dress. She didn't mind the silence. But when dusk rolled in and the wagon wheels sounded in the yard, she felt herself breathe easier. Amos bounded up the steps, holding a string of trout high above his head. "There were 5, but a raccoon took one," he said, eyes bright. Arabella followed more slowly, her cheeks sunburned and her braid half undone. She carried a folded blanket and a tin cup with a chip in the rim. "I didn't know the river could sound like that," she said. Gwendolyn took the blanket and ran a hand gently down her niece's arm. "You'll sleep well tonight." Xavier stood at the bottom of the steps, his hat in his hands. The sky behind him was streaked gold and plum, and his hair caught the color of the sun. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "They're good company." She hesitated, then stepped down to him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said the day you fixed the fence. I meant every word, I know." Her voice was quiet, "but I've lived long enough to know meaning something doesn't make it easy. I don't expect easy. I only expect honest." She met his gaze fully, the last of the sun warming the lines around her eyes. "I can give you that." He didn't reach for her, didn't try to close the space, but the way he looked at her, it held no hesitation. "I'll be by with seed catalogs next week," he said. "Thought we might choose what to plant, as neighbors, as whatever you'll let me be." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either, and when he turned and rode off into the darkening prairie, her heart felt somehow steadier in her chest. That night, after the children were asleep, Gwendolyn lit the oil lamp and unfolded the blanket Arabella had carried back from the river. There, tucked in one corner, was a feather white and gray, soft as breath. She didn't know where it had come from. But she pressed it between the pages of her ledger, near the back, where she'd once written down losses. And now, maybe, something new. By mid-May, the last of the snowmelt had dried from the creek banks, and a hush settled over the land that only came with the changing of seasons, less a silence and more a pause, as though the earth itself were drawing breath before summer's work began. Gwendolyn had planted beans in the west plot with Arabella, while Xavier turned the soil near the fence line for early potatoes. He didn't ask to stay for supper that evening, but when he lingered past dusk, she lit the lamp without comment and brought him a mug of chicory. He didn't drink it right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with a seriousness she hadn't seen from him before. "My mother died in childbirth," he said. "My father raised me until I was old enough to leave. He never spoke of her, not even once." "I used to think that meant he didn't love her." Gwendolyn waited, hands resting in her lap. "But now I think maybe her absence cut too deep for words." He finally took a sip. "Some things you carry quiet." She looked at him across the lamp's low flame. "I was engaged once. I was 23. He had a laugh that made people turn around in the street. "What happened?" "He died in Kansas. Fever took him before we could marry." Her voice was even. "After that, I stopped waiting." Xavier nodded slowly. "I never expected to be the one left standing." "You were married?" "No. But there was someone. She chose another man, moved to Oregon. I don't fault her. I wasn't ready then." Outside, the wind rustled through the dry grass beyond the barn, not strong enough to rattle the door, just enough to remind them how wide the land was. "I never expected you," Gwendolyn said. Xavier set the mug down. "But now that I'm here," she met his eyes. "Now I don't know what I did without you." He reached across the table, not to take her hand, but to rest his palm near hers, close enough to feel warmth. Far enough to let her cross the space if she chose. She did. That night, after he left, she folded her shawl over the kitchen chair and stood by the window. Amos was asleep already, curled around the small quilt Xavier had brought from his mother's cedar chest. Arabella had stayed up late helping Gwendolyn mend a tear in the hem of her church dress. Eyes heavy but hands steady, they were settling. Not into what had been, but into what was becoming. 2 days later, Xavier brought over a bucket of early rhubarb and a spare wire cradle he'd crafted for Amos's growing collection of wooden animals. When Gwendolyn stepped out to greet him, her apron was dusted with flour and her hair still damp from washing. "I was thinking," he said, resting the bucket on the porch rail, "if you'd let me, I'd like to till the north slope. It catches the morning sun better. You could grow squash up there." "I was thinking the same," she said. "But I only have one working plow and the blade's near worn through." "I've got a good one. I'll bring it tomorrow." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" He shook his head. "I don't mind the quiet, but I wouldn't say I've liked it." "Not the kind that lingers after dusk." She nodded once, as if confirming something she'd only just named in herself. Arabella came out then, arms full of laundry, and paused at the sight of Xavier. "You staying for supper?" He looked to Gwendolyn. She answered for him. "He is." Later, after the children were asleep and the dishes were stacked, she and Xavier walked out to the edge of the pasture. The sky was half clouded, but a few stars showed through, faint and stubborn. "You know what they say about women like me," she said, voice low. "Too old to marry. Too set in their ways. I know what they say. You don't seem bothered by it." He turned toward her, face unreadable in the dark. "I was waiting for you, Gwendolyn, not for a girl, not for someone easy to impress. I was waiting for a woman who's lived some. Who knows what she wants." She watched him, the breeze lifting the edge of her sleeve, "And what do you want?" He stepped close, not touching her, but near enough she could smell the dust on his coat, the faint sharpness of horses and wind. "I want to wake up beside you," he said. "I want to build a fence that keeps nothing out but lets everything grow." She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, she reached for his hand. "I want that too." No kiss followed, no dramatic pause. Just the steady weight of two hands clasped in the dark, firm and sure, like the land beneath their feet. The wedding was held on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the last frost. No fanfare, no preacher from town, just a quiet vow beneath the cottonwoods on Xavier's land, with Arabella holding a wildflower bouquet and Amos too fidgety to keep still. They stood together in the soft grass, where the fence lines met, the land shared now between them without papers or ceremony beyond what they chose to speak aloud. "I'll walk beside you," Gwendolyn said, her voice steady. "I'll build with you," Xavier answered, his hand wrapped around hers like it had always belonged there. The children stood close. Arabella, 10 now, had sewn a new ribbon into her dress. Amos clutched a carved bird Xavier had whittled him the night before. When it was done, they returned to the house, hers and his now, and cooked a pot of beans with onions from their spring garden. Gwendolyn made cornbread in the skillet, and Xavier brought in 2 chairs from the barn so they could all sit together. After supper, when Arabella had taken Amos upstairs to settle him, Gwendolyn stepped out to the porch alone. The clouds were high and pink-edged, the kind that promised dry weather for days. She crossed her arms over her bodice and looked out toward the far ridge where the cattle sometimes grazed beyond the trees. She hadn't gone that far yet. There hadn't been time. Xavier joined her quietly, setting a folded blanket across the bench before sitting beside her. "Ruth Lanning came by the mill this morning," he said. "Asked if you'd be teaching again come fall." "I haven't decided." He glanced over. "You miss it, parts of it." She watched a hawk circle overhead. "But I don't miss the way they looked at me. Like I was something to pity. You were never that." "I know that now." They sat in silence, the kind that settles easy between people who have stopped waiting for something better. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked, his brow furrowed. "Leaving this land?" "Starting somewhere new," he shook his head. "I've buried too many years in this soil, and now you're here." "There's a steadiness in you," she said. "It took me longer to find it in myself. You had to carry too much alone. I chose to. You don't have to now." She looked at him then, fully. Not just with her eyes, but with the part of herself that had once gone quiet for good. He met her gaze without flinching, without expectation, just presence. "I want to build a smokehouse," she said. "Behind the barn." He smiled, not wide, just enough to crease the corner of his eyes. "Then we'll build one." Arabella stepped out a moment later, a note of concern in her voice. "Amos is asking for you." Gwendolyn rose. "I'll sit with him." She paused before going inside, her hand resting for a breath on Xavier's shoulder. "Come in soon," she said. He nodded, and she disappeared into the warm light of the kitchen. Later, he joined her upstairs, where she sat at the edge of the bed, Amos curled against her side. The boy's breathing was deep, his fist tucked beneath his chin. "I had a dream last night," she whispered, careful not to wake him. "I was walking across a dry field, and then I heard cattle bells, and I turned, and there you were." He leaned against the doorframe. "That wasn't a dream." "No," she said, brushing Amos's hair back. "It wasn't." They moved Amos gently to his cot, and Xavier returned to their room while she washed her hands at the basin. When she came to bed, he was already lying beneath the quilt, one arm outstretched in invitation. She climbed in without a word. In the dark, his voice was low. "You're not too old to marry, Gwendolyn. I was only ever waiting to be seen. You were seen. You were always seen." She turned toward him, her hand finding his chest. "And now I'm home." They slept with the window open, the spring air drifting in, full of grass and river and the low hush of a world still turning. June settled in warm and dry, the kind of stretch that coaxed color back into the hills and brought bees buzzing low through the sweet clover. Gwendolyn rose early each morning, her hands already familiar with the rhythm of shared work, checking the smokehouse roof for leaks, watering the garden rows before the sun stood too high. The house had changed in small, certain ways. A shelf added near the hearth for Arabella's books, a second peg for Xavier's hat by the door, a new cradle Xavier had built for Amos's growing legs, longer now than when she first brought him west. One Tuesday, while Gwendolyn was mending the harness leather in the shade of the barn, Xavier returned from town with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He walked past the fence without calling out, set the package on the table, and crouched beside Amos, who sat digging with a spoon in the soft earth. "Mind if I borrow your engineer?" he asked. Gwendolyn wiped her hands on her skirt. "He charges in biscuits." Xavier gave a quiet laugh and lifted Amos into his arms, careful of the boy's smudged hands. "Then I'll consider it a fair trade." She followed them up the steps, her eyes drawn to the parcel. "What's that?" He nodded toward it. "Something I found at the general store." "I know you've been keeping your notes in that ledger with the cracked spine." Gwendolyn untied the twine, peeled back the paper, and paused. Inside was a hand-stitched folio with blank pages bound in smooth hide, the corners reinforced with pressed tin. "I thought you could write things forward now, not just remember what came before," he said. She ran her fingers over the spine. "I never said anything about the ledger." "You didn't have to." Later that week, they loaded the wagon with fence posts and headed toward a stretch of pasture that hadn't been tended in years. Arabella came along, her sleeves rolled and hair pinned beneath a bonnet, her quiet diligence more grown than childlike now. Amos stayed behind with Ruth Lanning, who'd offered to help mind him while they worked the far end of the property. The road was rougher than they remembered, pockets of dry earth broken by stone, old roots from cottonwoods creeping toward the wheel ruts. They rode in silence for a while, the sun casting their shadows long over the trail. "You ever think about what we're building?" Xavier asked, his hand firm on the reins. Gwendolyn watched the hills rising ahead of them. "I used to think survival was all I could ask for, and now I want something that holds." He glanced at her. "It already does." They reached the slope by mid-morning. The posts were heavy and the soil resisted each thrust of the auger. Arabella kept count, marking each corner with a stone. When they stopped for water, Gwendolyn leaned against the wagon wheel and looked out over the open stretch. "I want to keep bees," she said. Xavier wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Bees? There's clover enough, and the smokehouse can hold the combs once they're drained." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll build hives before summer ends." Arabella looked between them. "Will we have honey by fall?" "Not this year," Gwendolyn said, "but we'll have something started." By late afternoon, they had set the last post and braced the corners with wire. Arabella climbed into the wagon bed and began sorting the tools as Xavier and Gwendolyn stood side by side, surveying the stretch of land now enclosed. "It's more than I thought I'd have," she said. Xavier didn't answer right away. Then he reached out and touched her wrist, just lightly, where the skin had freckled in the sun. "You were always meant to have more," he said. That night they ate by lamplight with the windows open, the air full of soft sounds, the clink of utensils, the creak of floorboards, the low murmur of Amos talking to himself in sleep. After the children were settled, Gwendolyn brought the new folio outside and sat beside Xavier on the porch bench. "I wrote something," she said, "just the beginning." He looked over, waiting. She opened the folio to the first page. In her careful script, the words read, "This is where we began again, not because we had to, but because we chose to." Xavier reached for her hand. "Read me the rest when it's ready." She leaned against him, head resting on his shoulder. "I will." In the weeks that followed, they built the hives from repurposed pine, painted them with milk wash, and placed them near the south end of the garden. Arabella kept a notebook to track their observations. Amos learned to be still around the bees, watching them with wide eyes. One evening in August, Gwendolyn stood in the kitchen, drying jars for the first batch of preserved peaches. Xavier came in from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat, and crossed to her without a word. He took the towel from her hands and set it aside. "I want to marry you again," he said. She looked up, surprised. "We already did. Once, for the land, for the children, for the quiet knowing." But I want to stand with you in front of everyone who ever said you were too late. She hesitated, then smiled. Then we'll hold a gathering. They married again that September beneath a sky so wide it made the guests look upward in wonder. Ruth Lanning brought pickled eggs. The Thompsons brought fiddle music. Arabella wore a blue ribbon. Amos scattered dried petals in the dirt. Gwendolyn wore the same dress. She didn't need another. Xavier took her hands and said nothing new. He didn't need to. They danced once, slow and without steps, their boots scuffing the dry earth. Laughter rose around them, the kind that came easy when nothing was missing. That night, after the guests had gone, they stood at the edge of the porch, the house behind them lit with warm light. Gwendolyn wrapped her arm around Xavier's waist. "I don't feel like I've lost anything," she said. "You haven't," he answered. "You found your way home." And she had. They lived long and well. The bees took to the hives. The garden grew fuller each year. Arabella became a teacher just as she'd hoped. Amos carved birds until his hands were strong enough to build his own barn. The land held them all. Gwendolyn wrote until the folio was full. Then she began another, not to remember what came before, but to mark what had begun and stayed.